Okay, recording has begun. Robin, Edgar, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for being here and doing this.
You're welcome.
Um, I asked you here today because you're a photographer in Montreal, Quebec,
Correct, yeah.
and you have some very, very interesting and wonderful ideas about eclipses and Egyptian symbolism.
Well, yeah, you could say that. I actually have a much broader view. In other words, I have been researching how eclipses, especially total eclipses of the sun, have influenced the human civilization, for about a quarter century now. So I'm looking at not just Egyptian, but other cultures, Mayan, Aztec, Nazca, Indians in South America. Basically, every ancient culture, saw eclipses, saw total solar eclipses at various times, and they essentially came up with very similar beliefs, based on what they saw.
Awesome. I'm really excited for you to share some of that with us, and I'm also very excited because you are a very adept photographer who captures some amazing, amazing. And when you take pictures, I'm just gonna gush over your images for a minute because when you take pictures, you really truly capture the essence of the moment. That you get an entire story in a Robin Edgar image, especially with your use of contrast, of chiaroscuro, and your use of lensing. And so I would like to first I'd like to talk to you about lensing, and how this actually illustrates the points that you are making in your research about eclipses and ancient cultures, and how that also informs your understanding of this.
Well,
Let,
one
let's
thing I
start
will
with, oh, sorry,
right
but
off
let's
the
start.
bat, most of the images of eclipses that I use are not my own. There are
Okay.
other photographers. Sometimes they're even composite photos where someone has taken multiple images of the same eclipse from different photographers sometimes, and blended them into a single image to show what the corona looks like. And we'll get into that later. I'll show one of these. My own photos, I'm a documentary photographer. I did work as a freelance professional photographer for quite a while. I'm not working right now. But yeah, I essentially try to take very realistic photos of real life, try to capture the moment if you want, try to, like you said, try to get the story in a photo. I wouldn't say I'm the best photographer. I know other very, very good photographers, but I think I do quite well in terms of what I try to do.
Yes, you do. You're an excellent photojournalist because you go into these social situations, protests, demonstrations, the Native American tribal. What what was that exactly? That was
Well, actually, as far as Native American Indigenous peoples goes, I've been documenting various events, not just protests, but celebrations for quite some time now. Lately, we had the issue of the missing children, the children that were found in unmarked graves in Kamloops and other places, the residential schools. So there was a pretty big protest on Canada Day on July 1st that I documented. There was also some protests in Oka over land claims. And also last year is coming up for the anniversary in late September of last year. Woman basically died under very unpleasant circumstances in a hospital. She may have been given an overdose of morphine, or she may have been given maybe not an overdose, but a dose of morphine, but she's allergic to it. And in any case, she filmed with her cell phone, her final moments, and she captured some pretty offensive behavior on the part of nurses and healthcare workers. And so there's a fair number of protests about that following that, which I also documented. There was even one a few days later in early October of last year that I went to and then documented.
Oh, that's a horrible thing to have to go through for somebody. Gosh, how heartbreaking. And I'm glad that people are protesting this, and it's very commendable of you to also be documenting it, to share it with people who are outside of the area or outside of the know in that, so that people can be brought, this things like that attention can be brought to them, and people can stay informed about things like this, because these atrocities can't go on and these people are suffering. And without people like you uh, taking these types of images and showing them to the world and to a broader audience, most of us wouldn't be any the wiser. We wouldn't know how to participate or how to help, or what the situations are at the base level.
Well, this is well covered by the media. But what I do is I amongst other things, like I don't just take photos, I take video footage. And what I do is I upload the unedited video footage to YouTube. So that people can, they can hear all the speeches, they can see, how the protest went from beginning to end, kind of thing. The media will maybe have a few sound bites of a few seconds long from, some of the major participants, but you won't get the whole speech or anything. So I just put everything up there, and anyone who wants to, hear all the speeches and so on can do that. Yeah.
You afford us the experience. The media might give us the information, but your work affords us that experience.
Yeah, it's like you're there. I mean, that's essentially what I'm doing, is I'm documenting my point of view, and it's if you're there beside me. Yeah.
Yes, that's awesome. If you guys have never checked out Robin Edgar's work, you need to check out Robin Edgar's work. Okay, so this translates how. So let's talk about your work with the ancient symbolism and the eclipses, and what you've. Can you kind of give us a synopsis and then take us through what you've been learning and what you've.
Yeah, I can. And actually, I don't talk about it a lot because I try to keep the anthropology separate from the, religion, spirituality, whatever, in terms of presenting the information, so people can fit it into their own worldview. But my interest in eclipses actually started with a very profound revelatory mystical experience. In late January 1992, I had a very profound experience, feeling of God's presence, as it were. And even in the earliest stages, there was an emphasis on the concept of the eye of God. And then in the months following, I had a series of very unusual coincidences that had symbolic meaning. I won't go into the details right now, but Carl Jung called it synchronicity. He attributed it to what he called the collective unconscious. I, based on what I'd experienced, attributed it to God pulling a few strings here and there, influencing events at the subconscious level, like basically influencing human thoughts, mine and other people's, so that things happened in a way that you don't even know that you're being influenced per se, but nonetheless these bizarre coincidences happened. And so at a certain point, I recognized that these coincidences were, in a sense, being orchestrated, choreographed, whatever term you want to use. They were not happening just by chance. And I attribute it to God influencing events. And then 3 months after the initial experience, which, as I said, placed a strong emphasis on the concept of the eye of God, including opening the Bible randomly for the first time in many, many years, and reading a passage that said, "The eyes of the Lord are 10,000 times brighter than the sun. They see every step that mortals take." That was sort of the initial prompting. I got the May 1992 issue of National Geographic. I was a subscriber. It arrived in my mailbox, and I opened it up, and there was an article on the total eclipse of the sun of the previous year, 1991. And I will add that in the experience, there was also an emphasis on the sun as a kind of a symbol of God. And that's, right in the Bible, the God is the sun and the shield. There's nothing unusual about the sun as a symbol of God. So I was reading that article a bit more intently than you might otherwise do, all things considered. And I got to a few pages in, and it said, I can't remember the exact, well, you know what? I actually have it right next to me now that I think about it. It's on my bookshelf. I'll just,
Perfect.
I might even be able to show it. Yeah, I didn't even think of that. This is very impromptu, but so
Yes.
this is the article. It's in this issue of National Geographic with a tiger on the front.
Okay.
And so it has like a, very good photos of the eclipse.
Yes.
So I was going through it, page by page. This is a very close up showing the precision of the fit, as it were.
Yes.
So I'm going through it. The darkness that enlightens was the title, which is kind of cute. Okay, here we go. I got to this page, this one here, page 41, and it says right here, it says a glorious conjunction is the heading, and here's what I read. Any coincidence unmatched in the solar system, the sun's diameter is 400 times that of the moon's, and the moon is about 400 times closer to the earth than the sun. That combination allows the moon to cover the sun's disk as it passes between the earth and the sun. It goes on to say, were the moon's diameter 140 miles less, totality would not occur. So you'd never have a total eclipse of the sun if the moon was, that much smaller in diameter. But the minute I saw the word coincidence, after what I'd experienced, I said, no, this isn't by chance. This is, essentially intelligent design. Now you can, I don't believe in a God who sort of put things together like a building set. I do believe in the Big Bang. So in a way, that's even more impressive because the mathematics involved in that all happening, starting with the Big Bang, is more impressive than building something out of clay. So then a couple more pages. That's a few more pages. And then I got to this.
Wow.
Again, there's reflection and everything, but as you can see, you've got this black circle with rays coming out around it. The graphics are interesting because the black on the edge here, that's done by a graphic designer. So they're making it, the whole thing sort of rounder. Well, I immediately saw this and I immediately saw the similarity to an eye.
Right.
So to me, going back to the beginning of the experience where it directly referenced the eye of God and the sun comparison, and then seeing this is like, okay, I can do the math on this.
Right.
So that's that. Then a few weeks later, because as you can see, the way it's oriented on the page, you might be, because you
can see it, yes.
The thick streamers are going up and down. Well, it wasn't correctly oriented. The correct orientation is this way. How you actually, the real correct orientation is this way.
Right.
But a lot of photographers, when they have other images, they do it the other way, and the reason is because you're looking at something that looks a lot like a bird. It's not so obvious because this is poor image quality, but you'll see the wings on either side.
Definitely.
See the tail below. So when I saw that, as I said, about 2 weeks later, because I didn't see it right away. I only saw it when the magazine was laid out on my coffee table.
Right, just so.
And when I saw it, when I saw that bird pattern, the very, very first thought that came into my head within a second was, this is the phoenix. This is where the phoenix myth comes from. Like, I didn't know for sure, but that was my intuition, that this bird pattern in the sun's corona is almost certainly the inspiration for the phoenix myth, because this is this bird, it dies and is born again on a single day, just like the sun dies and is born again on a single day in an eclipse, total eclipse. And different cultures calculated the return of the phoenix coming every so many hundreds of years. There were different versions of how many years it happened, but it was always in hundreds of years, thousands of days. And in the myths, those days tend to be solar cycle days. So that,
Mm.
so anyway, I did my research. I began researching, researched the Phoenix myth. And, you know, the more I researched it, the more I found corroborating evidence that yes, in fact, this myth was inspired by this bird pattern. So this is one of those types of photos that I was telling you about, where somebody has taken, in this case, it's multiple exposures at different exposures, because the brightness range of the light from the sun's corona, the range from dark to light, is more than basically a film or a digital camera cannot capture the range of light in a way that is the same as a human eye sees it. It tends to be more contrasty. So what they do is they take, you know, a bunch of different photos at different exposure levels and then blend them to create something that's close to what the human eye sees. In some cases, it can be exaggerated, it might even show more detail than the human eye sees, but nonetheless, in this one, which it's the same eclipse as in the National Geographic, you clearly see the wings, the thick rays on either side of the sun, the bird tail below it, and then sort of one of the rays at the top looks a bit like the head of a bird. And actually, you see a solar prominence. Actually, it's funny because I've never really noticed this before until now and sort of made this connection. But you'll see that red flaming prominence inside the plume, as they call it, that looks kind of like the head of the bird. And again, you know, this sort of brings us back to the phoenix and the ashes, the flaming ashes. You know, you can see how that idea comes together.
Yes.
So let's see here. I'll try to get out of the screen sharing mode. I'm not an expert with Zoom. So.
Me either.
Okay.
They're stumbling through it. We're doing great.
So anyway, so that picture clearly shows the bird pattern. And so, as I said, I was researching the Phoenix myth, and that leads to a bunch of other mythical birds or even bird gods, which brings us to Horus, the Egyptian, they call it the solar falcon god. Well, you know, you look at that photo of the eclipse and you can see how someone could easily imagine that bird pattern as being a falcon or another bird of prey, an eagle or something. The Egyptians actually had their version of the phoenix. They called it the Bennu. In fact, the Egyptians, if you look at their symbolism, there's a lot of bird symbolism that's associated with the sun, and also, you know, crowns and royalty and so on. So you have the Bennu bird, you have Horus. There's also Nekhbet, the vulture goddess. A lot of the women in Egyptian, you know, Egyptian queens, you see them wearing this vulture crown. It's like it's literally like a bird wing down the side of their head. So I think this is all from the same source. It's all from seeing this bird-like pattern in the sun's corona. And we can stick with the Egyptian symbolism for a while, because in my research, I find that the Egyptians sort of they have it all together, you know, like they're like pretty much everything you can see in eclipse, it's incorporated into their religion. You know, other religions have this piece and that piece and maybe even 2 or 3 pieces, but the Egyptians seem to figure it all out, kind of thing.
Do you think that happened when they went from the polytheistic to the monotheistic, when they embraced Ra, the sun god, and then now all of a sudden this solar deity becomes like all inclusive of everything? So that was like,
quite the opposite, actually.
oh,
This dates back to the earliest Egyptian religion. Akhenaten, who was the pharaoh that tried to worship just the sun, actually he was, you know, they considered him a heretic, and he actually was.
yes, he was.
Like I said, they had it all figured out. They had all the symbolism. Now, they broke it down into individual gods. You had Horus, you had this, that, and the other god. I think part of it is because different people came up with different ideas about what they saw. And instead of rejecting it and making one better than the other, they embraced all of it. So they, all of the different perceptions, they sort of accepted and worked it into their theology. And then Akhenaten came along and said, no, it's just the disk of the sun. And he, I think, actually went against, well, it's not even, I think, it's a fact that he basically rejected all of the earlier religion, much of which was based on symbolism that's perceivable in eclipses, and said it's just the sun. That's it. That's all. Interestingly enough, there was a major total solar eclipse at some point, either towards the end of his reign or just after it, between him and Tutankhamun. And I think that total eclipse sort of was what ended or made them go back to the old gods, because the old gods basically showed up in the sky again, as
right. It's pretty apropos. They're like, this is what we think about, you're only worshiping the sun god. And it's like,
yeah. So the thing is, we have to talk about the moon too, because you can't have an eclipse of the sun without the moon. So there's a lot involved with the moon and the moon goddesses and so on. But in terms of the symbolism and the different gods, you cannot properly understand ancient Egyptian religion if you do not understand how eclipses of the sun, and to some extent the moon, but mostly the sun, and again, especially the total eclipse, when it's totally hidden. I mean, it's not always totally hidden. Sometimes the moon is too far away from the earth to cover the sun completely in an eclipse where it's central, and then you get a gold sort of ring, and that also has symbolism. And then in a partial eclipse you get a crescent. So depending on how eclipsed the sun is, you have a thick or thin crescent. Well, that crescent, if you see it at sunrise or sunset close to the water and pointing up, if you see the crescent like this close to water, well, it kind of looks like in a boat.
Yeah. And
you have this concept of the solar bark of Ra, BARQE. I don't know why they just don't say boat. They like to say solar bark, but
right.
But the concept of the solar boat of Ra is almost certainly, like I'm just being conservative when I say almost certainly. As far as I'm concerned, it's absolutely certain. But anthropologists and archaeologists, they don't like to be certain about things. They they don't want to say this is the absolute truth when they don't have absolute proof. And I can't absolutely prove it, but all of the evidence points to them seeing this crescent close to the water, sinking into it, rising out of it. Especially in terms of rising out of it, you have this crescent rising out of the water, literally taking to the sky. So you have this boat that starts in the water and then goes up into the sky. So that's the boat of the sun god. And actually it's kind of funny, because we had an annular eclipse in North America back on June 10th, not that long ago. And I got some photos of it here in Montreal. I had tried to get a photo that would kind of show that. I don't have like a clear view of just water, but Montreal is on the St. Lawrence River. It is a port. So I thought I'd maybe get a photo with that crescent, sort of above the water, with some land between it and the water, but nonetheless with the reflection in the water and clearly showing the sort of boat pattern. But unfortunately, it was too much cloud low on the horizon that day, and I didn't get the shot. I did get it later when it came above the clouds, but I didn't get the shot I wanted closer to water. But other people did. Other people in New Jersey and New York, looking across the Atlantic Ocean, took photos of this sun coming up out of the Atlantic Ocean. And I saw something in their photos that I'd never seen before. I'd always seen this crescent shape coming out of the water, like a clear crescent.
Mhm.
Sometimes a bit distorted because of the reflection and then the distortion with the coming through the atmosphere.
Right.
Well, their shots had a distortion coming through the atmosphere, and what was interesting is that it flattened out the bottom of the sun. So you had it really looked like a canoe, like it looked like a North American canoe with the pointed ends at each end, and then sort of a flatter bottom. When it was right on the water, it looked like this canoe right on the water. And it's kind of funny because a few days earlier, before I'd seen that photo, I said, I should look into if there's a myth about a solar canoe specifically. Like I should look
Right.
into North American indigenous myths to see if there's a solar canoe myth.
Mhm.
And I did some initial research and found a couple of things. And then after seeing that photo, I did some more. And to be honest, there's not a lot, but there's definitely some references in serious anthropological research where at least a certain number of North American tribes did actually have a solar canoe myth. So I think we know where that came from too. And
Right.
South America, I already knew that South American Indians uh, had solar boat myths. If you go back to Peru and Bolivia, Lake Titicaca, they have the reed boats there
Right.
that are very similar to the Egyptian ones. So they're already kind of gold colored because they're reeds, and they have the upturned ends. And here's the question too: is like, do the upturned ends of the boats, like, to what extent? I think what it comes down to is they probably always were upturned, just in terms of how a boat needs to work. But I think at a certain point, when they saw the solar eclipse boat
Right.
with the upturned ends, the ends of the crescent, I
Mhm.
think at that point, when they made that connection, then they started to embellish the ends of the boats, and some of them have dragon heads and so on. The dragon
Mhm.
is a mythical creature inspired by eclipses. Actually, any planetarium will tell you that. They'll say dragons are inspired by eclipses. They don't go into the details. They don't tell you why, but it's pretty well established in the astronomical community that the dragon myth is inspired by eclipses, and actually it makes perfect sense, and I can even tell you exactly why. Very common myth, like it's almost universal, uh, that people thought of solar eclipses as a snake eating the sun. They had other creatures too, the wolves and
Mhm.
and other creatures eating the sun. The idea of the sun being eaten during eclipses is
Right.
pretty well across the board. Everyone
Mhm.
had that myth, but some of them specifically thought in terms of a snake. Um, and the way I see it is there's some pretty good reasons for that. One is the fact that a snake, when it eats its prey, it sort of swallows it whole.
Mhm.
And you have egg-eating snakes.
Mhm.
So you have snakes that specifically eat eggs, and an egg and the sun, they're very similar in terms of shape. So you have
Mhm.
a snake swallowing whole this round object, so you can easily make the connection there.
Right.
But on top of that, when you're trying to follow the movement of the sun and the moon in the sky, when you're trying to track their movement, especially if you're trying to predict upcoming eclipses and so on,
Mhm.
we get a kind of a sine wave pattern. So the path of the sun and the moon in the sky and the ecliptic, it takes a very serpentine pattern.
Yes.
So you put those two things together, and it very solidifies the whole thing of the snake eating the sun. Well, we come back to that photo of the winged sun.
Mhm.
Um, Obviously any snake that eats the sun kind of has to be able to fly. So,
Right.
so if you put wings on the snake, well, now you've got a winged serpent.
Mhm.
You're just one step away from a dragon.
Right.
A dragon is a winged reptile.
Mhm.
So the way I see it is the dragon myth, the dragon eating the sun, it evolved out of it's sort of an embellished form of
Yes.
sun-eating serpent with some wings attached to it.
Right. And with those embellishments of the solar prominences and the little flames that you were saying, like the fire breathing dragon,
You
because
can
there's
easily
a
get that idea from the yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, people, they saw things, they saw specific things happening in eclipses, and then they used their imagination and came up with all these, mythical creatures, and ideas about the gods and the sun gods, and as I said earlier, if you want to properly understand these ancient so-called sun worshipping religions,
Mhm.
um, you have to understand how eclipses influence their beliefs. If you leave eclipses out of the equation, you're not going to properly understand, how they came up with their various beliefs. But I've been studying this for, as I said, a quarter century, and now it's like very, very obvious to me. Um, so yeah, we can come back to also to the winged sun symbol. I don't think I've
Mhm.
mentioned that yet. We spoke about the phoenix and mythical birds
Mhm.
and bird gods like Horus. Well, the Egyptians have the symbol of the sun with wings. So
Mhm.
just a sun disk, usually a red disk with wings on either side of it. They I think are vulture wings. Uh,
Mhm.
and you'll also see often in the Egyptian ones, especially a serpent, actually two serpents going across the tops of the wings. That brings us back to what I was telling you about the path of the sun and the moon
Yes.
having a serpent uh, pattern. So my understanding of the winged sun symbols with the serpents is that the serpents represent the path of the sun, like one's the sun, one's the moon,
Mhm.
male and female, so on and so forth. Um, and then you have the wings, and you have the sun disk. So that's very obvious, the sun with wings. So when you see this photo of a total eclipse sun with the wings, bird-like pattern, it's pretty obvious where that symbol came from.
It
Uh,
is.
the Mesopotamians had similar symbols. Theirs were actually more even bird-like, more similar to even scientific astronomical drawings of the eclipse. The Egyptians, they formalized it into real bird wings, and there, for some reason, almost never a tail. Like if you look at the Egyptian sun symbols, there's never a bird tail, or extremely rarely. Whereas the
Right.
Mesopotamians, they did see that fan-like pattern, the bird tail, and so their symbols have the bird tail. Sometimes the bird tail becomes the kilt of the sun god. So you have the sun god in the disc, and he's wearing a kilt,
Yeah.
which is also the tail of the bird. So this is in Assyrian winged
Mhm.
sun symbols. I might be able to pull one up. Let's see if I go back into my
Sure.
image file, and I can pull up an Assyrian sun symbol.
Yes. And
Uh,
while you're doing that, Ozzy, we can just think a little bit about vultures and why that specific bird was chosen. If you think about it, when it's flying above you, it's got that dark. I mean, vultures here in Michigan, anyway, they have like a dark space, and then the tips of their wings are kind of white.
mhm.
And you can't really see, because of the size of them, you can't really see their tail as much. And vultures eat carrion, so it goes back to that, like eating the dead, eating the carcass of what had once been through these eclipses. Like,
Well, yeah, the vultures are certainly associated with death.
mhm.
No question about it. The Zoroastrians, one of their, well, I don't know if it was one, I think it was their primary, if not only, method of burial was to put the bodies in what they call, I think they're called colons of silence. I could be wrong about that, but they're basically round open air buildings, and they put the bodies in the buildings, and the vultures come and eat them. So
Wow.
that's their burial method, and it probably goes back before the Zoroastrians. Like it probably pre-existed the Zoroastrians,
Mhm.
but that was, and maybe sometimes still is, their burial method. Well, I have the image of Asher here, so I just need to do the share screen again. Um, yeah, Okay.
That makes me think of them taking it off to the heavens, taking your remnants, taking you to the sky because they're birds and they're ingesting you. And then
Mhm. Yeah.
this is the skirt, the
Actually,
kilt.
I've seen some eclipse myths where they see it as the bird is eating the sun. So that bird pattern, instead of seeing the serpent as eating the sun, I can't remember which culture it is. I only saw this fairly recently,
Mhm.
and it's a fairly obscure small culture. It's not like a major civilization, but in their perception, the bird is eating the sun. So do you see
Mm.
the Assyrian symbol? So
Mhm.
do you see my arrow?
Mhm.
Okay, so here's the tail of the bird, which is also the kilt of
Yes.
Asher. So they're basically incorporating the sun god into the symbol, and you can see how it's kind of feathery. But if you look at the wings, the feathers are kind of going the wrong way in terms of real bird. Uh,
Right.
they're horizontal. They're going out on either side. It's actually much more like how the rays in an eclipse look. And this was noticed by a British astronomer, I think in the middle of the 19th century. A very prominent British astronomer. His name was Edward Walter Maunder. Um, and I came across his research, his hypothesis, while I was researching my hypothesis that the uh, Phoenix myth was inspired by this bird-like pattern. So I was in McGill University Library in Montreal,
Mhm.
and I was looking at a book called The Migration of Symbols. There's actually two or three books with that title. And it's all about how different cultures have very similar symbols. They try to explain it by cultural contact, which is possible.
Mhm.
But sometimes the distances in terms of geographical distances between the civilizations, and also in terms of time, like there's time differences, like even hundreds and thousands of years apart where they've got the same symbol. So
Mm.
not exactly easily attributable to actual cultural contact. But if you understand that everyone sees total eclipse of the sun, everyone comes up with similar ideas. They see the eye pattern, they see the bird pattern, they see the, in quotation marks, death and rebirth of the sun. They see the boat pattern and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
Then you can understand that they didn't need cultural contact to have very similar symbols and ideas. Um, so anyway, I was in McGill University Library. I was looking at this book, The Migration of Symbols, and in it there's an illustration, and it showed three different, or maybe four. Yeah, I think it was four different winged sun symbols. There was an Egyptian one. There was a Mesopotamian one, similar to this one. There was also one that was Mayan. So they
Okay.
identified a Mayan symbol as essentially the same thing. And there was also a Polynesian one.
Mm.
And they spoke about it fairly briefly, but they did say how these symbols were inspired by total eclipse of the sun. And they had a reference. And the reference said knowledge. That's the name of the journal. They had the date. They had the name Edward Walter Maunder. And I'm in McGill University Library, which is pretty old and has a lot of old books and magazines. I thought, I wonder if
Mhm.
that's here in the library. Like, I wonder if I can go find what they're referencing here. And I did. I went into the computer and I put in the pertinent information, and then there it was. The article in knowledge that they were referencing, it was called An Old Record of the Corona, was actually in the library. So I went
Mhm.
book, I made some photocopies and so on and so forth. And essentially, Edward Walter Maunder saw a similarity between astronomical drawings of eclipses uh, and these sun symbols. I think he first saw the similarity with the Assyrian ones. Like, I think it's actually either this symbol or
Mm.
one that's very, very similar to it. He saw a clear similarity. And when he first put out his hypothesis, because this thing in knowledge that I'm talking about, this was published in 1897.
Right.
But he actually put out the same idea earlier, even a few decades earlier. I think the earliest publication was 1830 something or 1840 something, and his early publication was strictly in terms of the Assyrian sun symbols, and he saw even how the astronomers were drawing the corona, like the way it was drawn was very similar to these sun symbols. And so he hypothesized, well, these sun symbols aren't just the sun, they're inspired by the fact that they saw eclipses, and then they're essentially drawing this bird pattern that you can see in eclipses.
Right.
um
Because Maunder was drawing them himself while he was documenting these. Because Maunder was, he just to add some credibility, or not credibility, but to add some, flavor, just a little more. He identified solar cycles that hadn't been previously, like long-term, long-duration solar cycles that hadn't been properly identified up until that point. And we even have like what's called the Maunder minimum,
right.
named after him. So what he's doing is by hand, because at that point we don't have all this tech to take pictures. He's drawing the pictures of the sun using a disk to block out the most light coming from the sun, or different filters, so that he's able to observe these prominences and behaviors. And so he can't see them with so much light coming through. So just like we do today on SDO or any of the other solar monitoring satellites, we kind of have to block out the main disk in order to observe properly what's going on around it. And so he's like, oh my goodness, he's doing the same thing that they were doing because he's doing it by hand. And I think we miss these types of things. Like, you're a photographer, so you're familiar with these things and you're tracking them in this sense. So it comes naturally to you to see. Your eyes are trained to see, and that contrast that a lot of people miss, and what is in those things. And so this person is tracking all of these things, and it just adds to his credibility to the substantial amount of work that he did, and what that does for what you're saying and how you're interpreting and the information that you're giving us. Like, Maunder was instrumental in what is solar science of today.
He was an incredible scientist. And actually what's interesting though is especially in the earlier article, which I think was published in Sunday Magazine, which is a Christian and he actually presents it in quite a religious way. Like, he sort of suggests, well, maybe we should think in this. He related it to a passage in I think is it Malachi, which speaks about the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings. So he specifically related to this passage in the Bible. And it's about the only one in the Bible where it speaks of the sun having wings. And I'm pretty sure it's the only one. What's interesting is, like, all of these ideas, the Egyptians knew about it, the Assyrians and Mesopotamians knew about it, the Mayans and Aztecs knew about it, but it's almost not at all in the monotheistic religions, and they certainly don't use these symbols. They went around and sort of destroyed a lot of stuff too. Obviously we have these Assyrian, Egyptian things. They weren't destroyed. We have some of the Mayan and Aztec artifacts, but a lot of things were, books were burned and so on. So a lot of this knowledge was just ignored or swept away. What I find interesting is Maunder clearly wrote about this in a very public way, in magazines in the 19th century, and nobody sort of clicked on it and said, hey, wait, maybe this is of some value. Maybe we should think about this some more. It sort of got forgotten and buried it, and I rediscovered it in my own research, as I've been putting it out there since the early mid 90s, and other people have picked up on that too, either because they saw what I wrote and amplified it, or they might have come up with it independently. They might have seen, they might have come across Maunder's article without any input from me and spoke about it. So thankfully, the whole winged sun symbol being inspired by total solar eclipses it's basically taken relatively seriously now by the anthropologists and the historians that are aware of it. I'm not sure how many are actually aware of it, but those who are, I mean, it's pretty much a no-brainer. I mean, once you see the similarity, it's pretty obvious. It's not like it's a big mystery or anything. So, in fact, one of the things I wanted to do was to show one of the astronomical drawings, because yeah, one thing I wanted to tell you, because I think you're largely right in what you said about Maunder. But I don't know for sure that he used what it's a coronagraph is the instrument you're talking about, where it has this disc that blocks out the sun, but then you see the prominences and maybe some corona around it. He may well have used one, he probably did, but he also went on eclipse expeditions. He went to different parts of the world to observe an actual total eclipse of the sun to gather scientific data. And not only him, but other astronomers and artists were drawing. Like, I'm not even sure, to be honest, like if Maunder was a sort of the head or chief astronomer of an eclipse expedition, I'm not sure he would have been busy drawing. He might have had other people doing that. But that's the point, is it wasn't, regardless of whether he did his own drawings, he had an overview. He was looking at multiple drawings by multiple astronomical artists, if you want to use that term. So he saw many other drawings, not just any that he did, but he saw multiple sources and saw the similarities. And the article in Knowledge, I think it actually shows at least 2 or 3 different sort of winged sun type astronomical drawings that he didn't do himself. And one of the most really good ones is by a guy called Etienne Leopold Trouvelot. And I'll see if I can just pull that up. Do you see this?
Oh, yes.
Okay, it's quite small because the actual scan, like this is from my old website days back in the 90s, when you couldn't put anything very big up on the internet. You had to pretty well make it small because there's very little bandwidth and so on. But this is actually 2 astronomical drawings of eclipses that I put one inside the other. But this one here, you see how the astronomers like drawing the corona as these sort of wavy lines on either side. Well, this is almost identical to that Assyrian winged sun symbol we saw. The way it's drawn, it's like these wavy straight lines coming off on either side in terms of the wings, and then it shows a bit of the polar plumes that sort of, but doesn't go into the full bird tail. And I inserted inside this another astronomical drawing that shows a cross-like pattern in the sun's corona. We haven't even talked about that yet, but one of the patterns in a sun's corona can be cross-like. I mean, the bird pattern is cross-like. You have the wings on either side, then you have the tail up and down. So that's kind of cross-like. But in certain eclipses, it looks more cross-like than others. And the other thing we have to take into account is that, these are perceptions. These are not, like, if you compare this drawing to the photographs, there are some clear differences. So this is about how the artist perceived things and set it into art, which may not match exactly what it actually looked like or what a photo would capture. But nonetheless, the same thing would have happened with ancient people. They would have seen, the actual eclipse. They would have seen the patterns in the corona. And then some of them, I guess, would have committed it to drawing of some kind or another. Right. And so their drawing might have differed somewhat from what they actually saw. But, nonetheless, you can see it in that Assyrian sun symbol where it's so similar to this. Anyway, getting back to the cross, I inserted the cross in the center there because there are some winged sun symbols that do have what I call a solar cross pattern in the central part, which, oh, look at that, I just magnified it a bit. Very low resolution, but I just tapped on it, it came up larger. But the resolution's terrible. But But anyway, you can clearly see the cross pattern here. And yes, I actually wrote a whole piece. You know, the solar cross symbol is very common. Most cultures have some form of it or other, including a lot of Native American. If you look at the cross patterns, that exactly they're equilateral. They're not the crucifix, and they often have a circle in the center. So if you see any cross with a circle at its center, you can be pretty sure it's comes from this, even if they don't, like people forget things, like they create these symbols and then they forget where they came from. So I'm sure, some people using the symbols, they don't even know exactly how they originated. So anyway, I just did this as an exercise because this combination of two astronomical drawings is very, very similar to some winged sun symbols that have the cross in the center. So I'll stop the share. And what I do want to find is this drawing by Etienne Trouvelot. So now this is the scientific astronomical drawing of the 1878 total solar eclipse. So you see above and below the sort of fan-like pattern, also very much like the iris of an eye. If you extended this all the way around, you'd have something that looked like a drawing of an eye. But this was one of the winged sun pattern types of eclipses. So you have these thick corona wings on either side, and then you have this sort of fan up and down. And I think this drawing from the 1878 eclipse, which obviously came after Maunder's earliest hypothesis, if I'm not mistaken, I think this drawing really clinched it for him, because it's so similar, especially with the one we saw before with the wavy pattern wings, and then this fan-like pattern above and below. When you compare these patterns to what you see in the Assyrian winged sun symbol, it's pretty well identical. And so that really clinched it for him. And yeah, getting back to Maunder, you mentioned about the Maunder minimum and so on. And that was part of his hypothesis in terms of the winged sun symbols, not the Maunder minimum in the major sense, because he's talking about something that spans centuries, I think. Right. But he did notice that the sunspot pattern, or the amount of sunspots, follows, I think, a 14-year cycle. So every 14 years it goes from minimum to maximum sunspot activity. And his hypothesis was that the winged pattern occurred at the sunspot minimum. And in fact, we had a couple of recent eclipses in South America, I think 2017 and 2019 and 2020. They were both viewable in Chile and Argentina, but different parts, because the paths were slightly different, well, even miles different. But nonetheless, both of those eclipses were around the sunspot minimum, and they actually had a pattern very similar to what we see in this drawing. In fact, before the eclipses happened, based on the fact that it was happening around sunspot minimum, and I also went to the Soho website, where they have the coronagraph images, months earlier, and I could see, oh, this is similar pattern. So I predicted that based on that information. So it wasn't like a just out of the blue prediction, it's based on actual science stuff. I predicted that the eclipses would have a pattern very similar to this Trouvelot drawing, and in fact they did. The photographs taken of both of those eclipses are very similar to what this drawing shows. So I think we've covered the winged sun pretty well. We've covered.
You're making me wonder how the interpretation of, like, if we view them as wings, how the interpretation of the wings and the transformation of their shape changes and their representation through time might give us a greater understanding of the smaller cycles within the larger cycle. Because, like you're saying, like, you were able to predict that it would have certain features based on what you saw from this one from 150 years ago, 200
Yeah.
years, so so can we look at representations throughout history of how these are accentuated, drawn out?
Funny you should mention that, because if we accept that, the depictions, from a particular era
Mhm.
are relatively accurate depictions of the coronal pattern, then we can sort of relate that to the sunspot cycle. And if it's sort of more bird-like, we can say, oh, well, maybe the sunspot cycle was low at that point.
Mhm.
And if it's more evenly distributed around, well, then we can say, well, then they saw the eclipse at maximum sunspot cycle where it's much more evenly distributed. But it's getting a bit iffy when you go back in the past. First of all, it's more and more difficult to accurately depict where an eclipse was seen because of the wobble in the
Yes.
earth and speeding and slowing of the rotation of the earth. So there are software programs that do predict paths going back as much as 7,000 years ago. So going back to 5,000 BCE.
Mm.
But how accurate they are, especially at the 5,000 BCE end of things, it's open to some debate.
Right.
Nonetheless, and the other thing you have to consider too is that the religious symbols are religious symbols. So once they were created, they lasted for centuries and even
Right.
millennia, and they might have been modified at times.
Mhm.
A new eclipse happening might have caused sort of a resurgence
Yes.
of use of a particular type of symbol, but it's not that accurate. So I don't think you can necessarily look at a
Right.
winged sun symbol from, let's say, 800 BC
Okay.
and relate it to a specific eclipse and say, well,
Right.
that specific eclipse that took place in that area at that time is accurately represented in this religious symbol. It might be, it's possible, and I certainly do that kind of thinking, but in terms of from a scientific accuracy perspective, it's a bit
Right.
but
Okay.
nonetheless, the symbols are there. We know, as far as I'm concerned, we know where they come from.
Mhm.
And you can do that to a certain extent, but you have to be aware that it may or may not be the case. But actually, this brings me to the Stone of the Seven Suns at Doubt.
Mm.
You might have seen
Yes.
so that's the interesting thing is I was doing my researches, and actually this is one of these funny coincidence type things. When I was doing my research in the library, I'd be looking for certain things, like there's certain information I'd be looking for,
Mhm.
and it would sort of just present itself to me.
Mhm.
Suddenly be there. Like somebody would leave a book on a table, and that would be the book I wanted. Or I'd be walking down an aisle of books in the library, and I'd sort of catch a glimpse of a title. I think maybe what I'm looking for is in there. And I'd pull it out, I'd open it, and bingo, it'd be right on the page I'm looking at. That's weird. It comes back to the opening of the Bible, where I opened the Bible for the first
Yeah.
time in ages and ages and ages. And the first thing I read says, the eyes of the Lord are 10,000 times brighter than the sun. They see every step the mortals take, and so on. So when these kind of things happen, it's like, yeah, I don't think it's just chance.
Right. It's too, and that's been a theme throughout this whole series that I've been doing, actually, like talking to people. The synchronicities, like you said, you were talking about when you first started in is this like a light bulb that's turned on, and suddenly people who have those receptors are able to see the thing that came to light. Are we all kind of uniformly realizing these things that, like you said, you're like, I don't know if it's because they saw what I did, or if they had their realizations on their own, or and it's like I'm sure it's yes, both.
Mhm.
I'm sure yes, both, because there's like these moments that it's like they're calling out to us, like once we're open to this, it's a calling, right? And once we're called to do the thing, then we see it. we see it everywhere. And that like I only have we only have like a few more minutes.
Right.
So what do you think is the greatest? Okay, so like we only have a few more minutes. So what's the greatest lesson here? But then again, that's like the forever question that cannot be answered in a few minutes.
Right. Well, I mean, there's all kinds of lessons. But if we stick to the eclipse symbolism stuff, the symbolism's there. You know, the perception by certain human beings who see an eclipse and they see a bird pattern. That's very obvious. The bird pattern is very obvious. So some people see it. The eye similarity is also quite apparent in some eclipses, and so some people see that, and some people see both, and so on and so forth. The point I'm trying to make here is that God or no God, even if you're a diehard atheist who doesn't believe in God at all, who's convinced God doesn't exist, there's no intelligent design, it's just all random chance. Well, the fact remains that total eclipses look like an eye. Total eclipses bird pattern. So whether it's by accident or by design, it's there. People saw it. People responded to it in their religious beliefs and practices and so on, and their mythology. You know, mythology is just a word for other people's religious beliefs that we don't believe.
I love that. Yes.
You know, is just, you know, another culture's religious beliefs is what it comes down to. So for me, the you know, from my perspective, I believe that, you know, God is a loaded word, you know, because when you say God, people immediately think in terms of the biblical, you know, Abrahamic God, but that's not necessarily the case. You know, the indigenous people use the term the creator, which I think is a better overall term in terms of what I experience and believe anyway. You know, I think in terms of God more as the creator than, you know, God per se. One of the things that I found interesting was that my experience did begin with some Christian references, opening the Bible and this, and some of the synchronicities had Christian elements to them, one in particular. But you know, I actually did go to clergy, and I was telling clergy about this. I was trying to get them to even investigate what I was, you know, experiencing and learning, and they were basically not interested, to put it nicely. Some were even hostile. What I found bizarre was that Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all of these three major monotheistic religions, this is simply not really there. There's a few little references here and there. Like I said, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings. That's about the only reference I know of where the sun's wings are referred to in the Bible. The passage from, it's actually the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus. It's not even a book that's in Protestant Bibles. It's only in Catholic Bibles that have some of the Apocrypha. You know, the eyes of the Lord are 10,000 times brighter than the sun. You won't even find that in Protestant Bibles. It's only in Catholic Bibles. I happen to have this Catholic Bible that I bought at a book sale cheap because it had a broken spine. That's kind of interesting too, the broken spine of the Bible. But anyway, I won't get into that too much. But nonetheless, what I'm getting at is like the idea of the you know, like the idea that a total solar eclipse symbolically represents God's awareness. It's not there in any of those major religions. But you know, the Egyptians seem to understand it. The Mesopotamians seem to understand it. The Mayans and Aztecs, they had these symbols. You know, how they responded to them is not always pleasant. There's some pretty unpleasant stuff, but nonetheless, the basic idea, you know, they saw these symbols and they did respond to them. They're there, and you know, I just find it strange how the mainstream monotheistic religions are basically oblivious to this. You know, it's just not there, and they don't consider it of any importance. You know, they don't teach this stuff in Sunday school, that's for sure.
They don't. And to kind of like leave on a thought note, what I'll be looking at today, and now after we get off this, get off the call, I hate to say it like that, but I don't mean to be rude. I'm just like, my brain goes like 12 places at one time. So if ever I'm like seem a little scattered, it's because I'm like trying to grab the one thing. You know what I mean? and then I get like, I need to go find out what this one thing is, and then like everything else I have to dig back through. So thank you for bearing with me. In 709 BC, right, there was uniformly throughout there was uniformly throughout the world 5 days added to the calendar, and suddenly eclipses became predictable and like more, I want to say predominant, but became more more well understood, and I want to say more predictable. Like the people knew when they were going to come, and I'm not sure. So now after this conversation, which is why I'm like, I need to write this down and I need to find out what this is, because what you're saying brings to light how important these events were, and that they were cherished before, after, understood before 709 BC, obviously, and a huge big deal. And in that point, kind of, was that the same point where their importance was kind of omitted, right? Because you're saying like the Abrahamic religions.
Where you're talking about the 700 BCE, I am fairly conventional in terms of astronomy. I don't think there was any major disruption of the paths of the the orbits of the Earth around the sun and the moon around the Earth and so on and so forth in the last 10,000 years, shall we say. My research shows that the eclipses were seen, and particularly the eye pattern, particularly the bird pattern, that goes back to the earliest Egyptian religion, which goes back to around 3000 BC.
Right.
There's evidence at the Irish passage tombs, Nowth, Newgrange, all of them, as far as I'm concerned, have total solar eclipse imagery, and they're all older than the pyramids. They go back to like 3500 BC or even earlier, some of them. So it's not a huge difference. We're talking about half a millennia or so, or a millennia at most. But nonetheless, there's evidence that the Irish passage tomb building culture understood the symbolism, were aware of it. Dow's Stone of the Seven Suns, which I mentioned earlier, which I haven't been able to show, the rayed sun symbols on it are almost identical to scientific astronomical drawings of the 1851 eclipse, with this very, you've seen the images. I think maybe we just have to do another. Do we have time, or?
Yeah, I would love. Please show us that. I'm sorry. It's like I said, don't be rude. And I have like
my own thing with Dow is I suspect that the Stone of the Seven Suns is sort of a later addition. I don't think it was the earliest. I don't think it was. I think it was sort of. Okay, here we go. I got so many different images.
It's fine. This is going to be crucial. And I didn't. So, yeah, did things move at a certain point? My interview before this one is about that. That one hasn't been published yet, but hopefully by the time this one comes out, that one will have been seen. So that is about these types of events happening that would either elongate the calendar, change the circumference of the orbit, do different types of things within certain time spans.
As far as calendar goes, I mean, don't forget we the Western civilization changed its calendar. It went from the Gregorian to the Julian. Nothing changed in terms of astronomy. It's just how they calculated it that changed, because the Gregorian calendar just wasn't that accurate. There was this. So maybe what happened in 700 BC is something similar. Maybe their calendars were a bit off, and they readjusted their calendars to be more accurate, rather than, let's say, the actual sun and moon's orbits changing, because I'm pretty sure that didn't happen. I know some people have these theories, but the fact of the matter is that the eclipse symbolism that I'm talking about, the bird symbolism, the eye symbolism, at minimum, it goes back to 3,500 BC. So I don't think there was any change in terms of total solar eclipses between then and now. Like I don't think
Okay.
anything's changed. But I have seen cave art, and we'll maybe end on this. I've seen cave art that is basically rayed sun symbols, inspired by seeing a total solar eclipse of the sun. And this cave that's my assessment of it, because it looks like every other rayed sun symbol I've seen, and it's estimated to be 20,000 years old. So
that's way back. That's
exactly
like before the Younger Dryas. That's okay. So, wow. And then also, gosh, I didn't get to talk to you all about lenses.
I was going to say, like, maybe we could do another interview down the road a bit. You can interview other people, but I think we could do a follow-up if you want. Yeah.
I would really like that. And I think that that's really important, because I think that we could have another equally, I mean, at least this long of a conversation about that and refraction, and how the different, like, because the boat and how that changes because of the atmospheric perspective of the.
I'm not an expert on that,
No.
I know that it does happen. But I'm not the, I mean, it's because of the atmosphere. It basically acts kind of like a lens, it slows down the light coming through it and so on and so forth. Again, I'm not an expert, meteorologist.
No, but you're a photographer.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at is like, if you want to explain, why the crescent of the partially eclipsed sun is flattened, at the surface of the water, then I'm not the guy to give you the scientific explanation for that. You'd want an expert who can do that.
I think that you are the guy to talk to us about how bent glass changes light, and how bent glass, the curvature, convex, concaves, the amount of aperture that allows how much light in, because all of these things.
Just the actual aperture is actually just a blade inside. It's not the lens itself. It's a mechanism inside the lens that opens or closes a hole bigger or smaller. So that has nothing to do with the lens itself, other than directing the light. But yeah, the lens itself does refract light, because different wavelengths have slightly different speeds. And so when you're going through the glass, essentially that's how a prism, what a prism is. A prism separates the wavelengths, because the prism's triangular. So there's less glass to go at the top, more at the bottom. So that triangular shape to the glass causes the different wavelengths to separate. So I can tell you that, but I'm not an expert on this stuff at all. Yeah.
But that's how I mean, I think that you're seeing things much more clearly than you realize, and that a lot of other people are seeing them. And it's a gift and a amazing thing to get to talk to you about all of this, and how you got there. I definitely want to talk to you more about that. So if you wouldn't mind having another conversation at another time, I would.
But that's the first time I think we've had a video chat. So
yeah.
And I hopefully other people find it interesting, and
they will
certainly do it again.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today, and definitely we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thanks. Bye. You too. Bye.